Okay.
I'm ready.
Cool. All right. It'll begin 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining. I am very excited to be welcoming you all, as well as our presenters, to today's Tech Talk. We're going to be focusing on stakeholder engagement. And so just to give a brief background, the way that today is going to work is I'll introduce the topic. We'll go through what NRIC is and what NRIC's focus is. We'll go through some presentations preceded by introductions and bios of each of the presenters we have. And then we'll go into a Q&A session for kind of the second half. And so we definitely invite questions from the audience. We're going to try to make that as kind of conversational as possible. But we also have some questions on our end too that we want to go through. So to get that started, I'll just introduce the topic again. So effective stakeholder engagement can improve siting and construction outcomes for nuclear energy infrastructure by building stronger relationships with the communities that host this infrastructure. In this webinar, professionals from both inside and outside the nuclear industry share how operationalizing stakeholder engagement and company practices can help to achieve these benefits. So next slide, please. Great. So in order to participate, for the best experience, we'd recommend turning off your VPNs. We're going to have a Q&A chat window thing, so you can submit any questions through there, and we'll address them. If you have any technical problems, please put those in the Q&A. If you have programmatic questions for NRIC, our email address is here, nric@inl.gov. And then finally, this event is being recorded and will be posted on the NRIC website, so your attendance is consent to that recording. Next slide. So NRIC, the National Reactor Innovation Center, is a Department of Energy Nuclear Energy Office center that was launched in fiscal year 2020. And our primary focus is on accelerating nuclear reactor demonstrations. So we were authorized by the Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act, also known as NECA. We partner with industry to bridge the gap between research and commercial deployment. We leverage national lab expertise and infrastructure, and then we manage demonstrations to success. Next slide. Our vision is to achieve 2 advanced reactor demonstrations by the end of 2025 and commercial advanced nuclear by 2030. Next slide. And we're driven by a mission, which is to inspire stakeholders in the public, empower innovators, and deliver successful outcomes. Next slide. And the way we're going to get there is through collaboration. So this is just kind of a snapshot of all the different organizations that we work with in order to achieve these outcomes. We're really about trying to help bridge the kind of network between private companies and the US federal labs, as well as all the stakeholders in between. And this has been our goal, and this, again, is how we're going to be able to achieve this mission. Next slide. Great. So I'm very excited to introduce today's speakers. I'll just start by providing a little background on where this topic came from. It's something I've been interested personally for several years now, and something that NRIC leadership has also been interested in, to look at when we kind of zoom out from the specific nitty-gritty of some of the engineering around these reactors. We have to think about what the impact of these power plants and technologies and facilities are going to be more long-term. And especially how we build partnerships and identify potential hosts for these facilities. And that requires kind of a toolkit that I don't think we traditionally get taught in engineering programs, and something that really comes down to figuring out how to interface with the public. Nuclear has had trouble with public engagement for a long time. And so at NRIC and in my work specifically, we've been looking at, well, what are other industries doing, and what type of historical experience is there to try and address this issue? And so I've been very lucky through my work at NRIC to connect with kind of a network of people who've been focused on this work throughout their entire careers. And I'm excited to introduce a few of them today. And they're going to present on their experience, their expertise, kind of why they do this work. And hopefully we'll be able to draw some lessons and discuss some findings that will be applicable to advanced reactor vendors, other types of project managers who are doing work in the advanced nuclear sector today. So we're going to go through the presentations alphabetically, and starting with Elizabeth, and then Jim, and then Mackenzie. And before each of their presentations, I'm going to give a longer biography. So today we're joined by Elizabeth Helvey, who's the project manager of Tribal Radioactive Materials of the Tribal Radioactive Materials Transportation Committee at Northwind Services LLC. We also have Jim Hamilton, the executive director of the Nuclear Decommissioning Collaborative, and Mackenzie Lyon, who's the VP of External Affairs for Perpetua Resources. So starting with Elizabeth, I'm just going to read her bio, and then Elizabeth, you can take it from there with your presentation. So Elizabeth Helvey has over 30 years of experience designing stakeholder engagement strategies related to the transportation of spent nuclear fuel and the siting of nuclear facilities. Ms. Helvey specializes in working with state and tribal governments to prepare emergency responders, elected officials, and the public along the routes used for shipments of SNF. She has supported the U.S. Department of Energy's efforts with the National Transportation Stakeholder Forum and the Tribal Radioactive Materials Transportation Committee, as well as private industry clients siting nuclear facilities. Her experience includes support to the Office of the Nuclear Waste Negotiator's effort to site an interim storage facility in the 1990s, leading a team that supported DOE's consent-based siting effort in 2015 to 2017, leading a team advising Southern California Edison on strategic considerations to move their spent nuclear fuel offsite from the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, and working with Ultrasafe Nuclear Corporation on siting micro-modular reactors. So I'm very excited for your presentation, Elizabeth. You can take it from here.
All right, thank you very much, River, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. As you heard in my bio, I've done both state and tribal engagement, some general public engagement as well, but primarily focused on state and tribal governments. And for today's presentation, it's going to be fairly brief, and I'm going to hit the highlights of, focus on hitting the highlights of engaging tribal governments, which is fairly unique when compared with other stakeholders. So next slide. All right, just to provide a legal basis and history to give all of this context. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. About a third of those are in Alaska. Tribes are considered sovereign nations in this country. There's a body of law and Supreme Court rulings from the 1830s that establish their sovereignty. So they're not really beholden to state laws, except in a few areas where there's some confusion. One example, probably the best way to illustrate this, is Public Law 280, which gives some states some authority to do law enforcement on tribal lands. That, as you can imagine, tends to cause some tension between the state and the tribes within that state, and but it's something to be aware of when you're thinking about engaging with a tribal government or bringing them into a siting process that you're involved in. Because they're sovereign nations, they have to be dealt with in what's called a government-to-government relationship. So you would treat them almost as if they were the same as like Canada or Mexico, where you may have staff, corporate staff, government staff engaged with staff at a tribal government. That does not mean, just because you all may be agreeing on a path forward, that does not mean you have the tribe's buy-in. Their leadership needs to be talking with the corporate leadership or the government leadership, and the agreement really comes from that level. So even though the sovereign status and the government to government is really a requirement on the federal government, corporations would also be very well in good standing to consider that as well in their relations and in their outreach. The feds also have a legal requirement, a fiduciary responsibility to protect tribes' assets, their resources, their treaty rights. And this is called a federal trust responsibility. And they are required to ensure that federal law is followed when dealing with tribes. So you have that overlay as well. You can see in these two maps, they're pretty small, I realize, but there are a whole lot of Alaska Native communities. There's a lot of reservations in the lower 48. There is a different legal status between them that's important to keep in mind. Federally recognized tribes in the lower 48 had treaties at one point with the federal government, and their sovereign status is based on that. Alaska, because it became a state so late, there were never any treaties with the Alaska Native communities. And so there was this period of uncertainty from when Alaska became a state, a period of uncertainty as to how they were supposed to be considered, how they were to be engaged, how much governance they could maintain over their own lands and people. So that was settled in 1971 through the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which created 12 regional corporations based on tribal affiliations. And then within those regions, you also had over 200 village corporations. So it's a very different, whereas in the lower 48, you just have the government, almost like an elected state government, although they are not all. That's another thing to keep in mind with tribes. Some of them have a more traditional governing system, and some of them have a governing system that's more similar to what you would see in a state. So you just need to keep those differences in mind. But the Alaska Natives are structured as a corporate entity, a profit-making entity. In addition to that, you can have tribes who just maintain their historical leadership and community based on their cultural and historical precedent. So you really have three entities, and if you're doing business in Alaska, it really behooves you to have somebody who's familiar with that landscape working with you, because it's quite different than the lower 48. I also wanted to, this may be evident, I don't know who's on the call and all of your different knowledge levels, but no effort to work with tribes in this country is going to be successful if you don't lead with the history and understanding the impact of the history on tribal nations. Really, the uranium mining and other extractive industries have had a really negative impact in a lot of ways, continue to have a negative impact on the health of the land that they often hold, that they hold dear, that they're dependent on for their livelihoods, and on the health of their people. There's also the contamination from weapons testing. A lot of the tribes were, downwinders, and they have those implications. There were also nuclear experiments and nuclear activity going on in Alaska that has really created a trust gap for any future projects in Alaska. That you really have to lead with that in your conversations so that they know you understand why they're skeptical and can respect why it's going to take them quite a bit of engagement to see if this is, if a nuclear project is really something they want to be involved in. And I can tell you that I was actually in a meeting this fall that I was the only nuclear person in the room dealing with. It was a tribal meeting from tribes all over the country, including Alaska. And I almost got booed out of the room just because of that distrust and that gap of credibility that the nuclear industry has. So that's just an example of you've got to start where they are, and that's where most of them are. Also, in the past, they really didn't have any power at the table to influence the decisions that impacted them. And so, their values, their culture, their priorities were never factored into the decision making around these projects. So a lot of times when you go to speak with a tribal government or tribal representatives, they're going to start with that. They're going to want you to know their history. They're going to want you to know what they think of the industry and their lack of trust in the government and industry. So it's really important to kind of get that on the table. So how do you do that? Next slide. Let's go on to the next slide, and I'll get into a little bit into the how-to. I am going to let the other two panelists on today really talk more in depth about engagement and what is engagement. I'm just going to focus it on the tribal aspect. It is not your corporate communications. It's not your public relations department. And it is certainly, please do not say it's educating people. People can know everything you know about the technology, and they can have different values and priorities and come to a different conclusion. When you talk about educating people to get them on your side, it's incredibly insulting to their intelligence and to their independence as a person to make decisions about this work. So what is engagement then for tribes primarily? I think this is true across the board, but it's really true given the history with tribes and nuclear projects. That is, it is giving the people who are impacted by your project a seat at the table. It is equalizing the power differentials. They need to have they need to know that they can weigh into these decisions and have impact, and that they have the strength and authority to protect their lands and their people. And if you can't find a way to do that, I think the chances of a project being successful are very limited. So how do you go about that? What are some of the how-tos? Next slide, please. So when you're citing a nuclear project, you could be working with a tribal government now, and you could be dealing directly with them, and that's fairly, that's straightforward in some respects. If you have a project that you're citing that is not on tribal land, that does not mean you don't interact with tribes. I really would encourage you to look at your role, your sphere of influence for this project very broadly. In fact, I have one tribe that has been, their staff, not their elected leadership, but their staff have been complaining to me that there is a nuclear project right now that's being talked about quite a bit in the country. It's in a state that they're not in. They're across the border from that state, but they have historical and treaty lands where they can go and hunt and fish and you use the land according to their treaty rights, even though it's not on the reservation, and that entity has not contacted them. That entity, that corporate entity, is working with the tribe in that state, but it hasn't gone across the border to the other state to engage them. So I think it's really important that you draw a broad sphere of influence. If you think of the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears from the Carolinas to Oklahoma, clearly they're going to have sacred lands in North Carolina and South Carolina that they're not going to want you, they're going to care, even though their reservation may be in Oklahoma. So think of it broadly like that, and think of these historical connections. And you will save yourself a lot of surprises when somebody comes in really hot and angry halfway through your decision making. Timing. The timing of this I realize that especially a corporate entity, you have quarterly reports, you have investors you have to keep happy, and a lot of this can be very difficult to resolve in that sort of corporate context. But if you want your project, if you want to increase the chances of your project being successful, I strongly advise you to look at your schedule and then move the engagement as far to the right, absolutely as far to the right as you can. Even if you're not sure exactly where your project's going to go, be in touch with people where it might go. Give them as much say as possible over location. Think of all the decisions that you could make that they could weigh in on, that could help shape it for a project that works for them. And to do this, they need to be at the table, and you need to empower them to have these conversations and not just dismiss their concerns. You have to really, it's ongoing. It's not a one-time, we send you an email. I had one tribal gentleman tell me earlier this week, he said, correspondence is not consultation. Don't send me a couple letters and have a phone call with the tribal chair and tell me we have an agreement. It doesn't work like that. You have to really move your schedule of engagement as far to the left as you can, have people there in a meaningful way, giving you input that actually has an impact on how you move forward. Try to design your project so it works for them. And I don't mean just economically. That can certainly be a big concern, but maybe, again, you're citing it in a sacred area. Can you move it? Are there other locations that are just as technically sound? Are there ways to design the project that works for the tribe? or the tribal entities nearby your project. Doing that, when you bring them in early and you give them a meaningful role in the decision making, that is how you go about correcting these power differentials. That will give it a different dynamic. It doesn't ensure success, but it improves your chances of success. Also, if you're going to approach a tribe, you really need to do your homework first. You really have to do a deep dive on their history, their treaties, what treaties have been broken, what industries have impacted them, how they've dealt with that. You have to really understand their values, their cultural, economic, environmental values, and it is not their job to educate you about them. It's your job to educate yourself about them. And you really need to take that seriously. That is, those are some of the main points. One on the timing and bringing them in early. Look for opportunities for them to include their Indigenous and technical knowledge. For an engineer or somebody who's used to just really doing the technical science of it, that may be kind of a difficult, that we may be like, well, how do you even do that? But you would be surprised how many projects around the country actually are being influenced by this now, and to the betterment of the project. So that, try to be very, very creative in what you're willing to listen to and consider from their point of view, and they're more willing to take you seriously and trust that you could be a partner worth engaging with in the future. And I think that those are my main points. I know it's rather brief. River only gave us 5 to 10 minutes, so I don't want to take up too much time. And I'm happy to answer any questions. But just in conclusion, I would just say your real role here, the thing you really need to think about is do no harm. Again, I realize people have quarterly reports and investors they have to be happy. But the nuclear industry has been so impacted by its ability to progress from lack of trust from the public and from tribal nations that I would just ask everybody to really think about when you're moving your project forward, even if it doesn't go forward in a particular community, if you can leave that community better off than you came into it, it helps the whole industry. It helps everybody sort of feel like they matter, their opinion matters, their values matter, and it'll make everything in the future easier. And in a time of such political division across this country right now, I always look at it as almost a patriotic act. It's these types of conversations that's going to bring us together and be meaningful for people. And that's how we're going to hang together, is by giving each other that respect in that time. So that is where I will leave it for now. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll kick it back to you, River.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So our next presenter here is James Hamilton. Most people know him as Jim, and he's the executive director at the Nuclear Decommissioning Collaborative. Jim specializes in socioeconomic, regulatory, and public consultation aspects of large-scale energy infrastructure projects. So at present, he is the executive director of the Nuclear Decommissioning Collaborative. In his work with the collaborative, Jim helps local, state, and federal stakeholders quantify, then mitigate the socioeconomic impacts from commercial nuclear power plant closure. In parallel, the collaborative works with host communities and utilities to plan for long-term economic resiliency in the energy transition arena. His focus areas include spent fuel storage systems, socioeconomic impact management, environmental justice, stakeholder engagement, economic development, and creating local community hosting agreements. Mr. Hamilton is also working with the U.S. Department of Energy on its nuclear waste management program, specifically their near-term efforts with respect to federal consolidated interim storage. Jim has also advised Canada's First Nations committees on environmental matters, served as the Vice President of Sustainability for a global mining entity, and taught graduate courses in environmental policy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Jim earned undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of British Columbia and MIT, respectively. His volunteer work has included serving as co-chairman of MIT's Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Global Collaboration Committee. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks. You can hear me, I assume?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I mean, just to condense River's intro, I spent 30 years putting things people don't like in places they don't want. And so I'm just going to share a little bit of observations about that today. So next slide, let's talk about citing for a little bit. Let's just be honest. What's a developer want? Traditionally, they want a piece of property, they want to be left alone. I mean, that's honestly, I think, what most of the traditional developer mindset looks like. And I get that and I understand it. Next. But then the question, what's the host want? And developers traditionally say, well, it's got to be money. It's got to be jobs and taxes. But beyond that, they really don't know what the host community wants because they don't have a relationship with the host community. They don't know what kind of questions to ask. And teasing out what hosts want takes time and it evolves. And often it's not verbalized until the question is even raised in the first place. So there's this sort of tension between we think they want jobs and taxes, but we're not entirely sure what they want. And only after you start conversing do you really get a sense of which way north is. And at the end of the day, what developers traditionally find is that the communities want way more than job or than money. I mean, not more as in quantity, but they want very different things. They want access to resources to help them make decisions. They want a greater say in the future of their community. They want increased control over approvals and oversight throughout all phases of the project from now until it's done. They want control of their own destiny. That's what they're looking for. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect between a developer walking in saying, I got jobs for you, and the community's going, hey, I'm assuming you're going to give me jobs. What about this other stuff that we have to sort of talk about and learn together? Next. And so to boil it down, developers come in wanting a transaction. Hosts come in wanting a relationship. Transaction versus relationship. If you take nothing else from this talk, think about those two words. Now, if you're a developer and you can get away with a transaction, fine. Knock yourself out. Good luck. My sense is those days are gone. No developers anymore that I'm aware of are able to get away with a transaction. They all come to the table thinking they're going to get one, and they get placed into relationship mode pretty quickly. So I'm a recovering engineer and I get to draw graphs. So I want to graph what a relationship looks like. Next slide. Right. Okay, typical relationship chart. You start on the left. Hi, how are you? You meet somebody. You might kiss a bunch of frogs on whatever side, but anyways, you meet somebody. Then you start to court and you start to figure each other out. You explore mutual values, interests, hopes, and dreams. You figure out what it is that we want out of this relationship. And if there's a there, maybe there's a good fit based on trust and shared values, then maybe you decide to commit. And that process takes years. But once that commitment is made, once you go to the altar, for lack of a better word, then you get married, then the real work starts. And that real work never ends. And in traditional vows, there's this till death do us part thing, right? So the x-axis here is kind of important. This is a long-term deal. And it starts out with a little bit of risk taking up front, but only when you get fully into it, do you really have a level of commitment where you're both comfortable jumping in, into a long-term committed relationship. So that's the squishy, touchy, feely relationship world. Let's look at how you start a facility. Next slide. Instantly, they're the same, right? You start off with a little bit of courting or of hi, how are you to begin with, but a developer and a community explore mutual interests, values, hopes, and dreams. Elizabeth talked about that, getting to know each other, right? What is it that both parties want out of this relationship? And then you might go into the permitting phase, but you only go into that if there's a reason to commit to that. based on trust and shared values, right? And then you get your permits, you need to go into construction and operation. But look at the x-axis again. You're years up front building those relationships, building that trust, figuring out what both parties want before you put a shovel in the ground. And a lot of times, next slide, developers totally blow that off. They think they can jump into construction and operation and permitting after a couple emails and a few coffee and donut sessions, and we're off to the races. No, that transactional model doesn't work. I see McKinsey nodding her head. I mean, that's just sort of the dynamic that I've seen historically, is that there's this impatience to sort of get through the courting phase quickly, get permits filed right away, and then we're off to the races. And if I had a nickel for every one of those projects that started that way, that got torpedoed by somebody's grandmother, I'd be on my boat right now. I mean, I'm not trying to be glib, but there's a lot of scars on this as a result of this sort of impatient approach that fails to understand sort of the relationship dynamics around this issue. Next slide. So look, I only got 5 minutes, so I'm just going to be brief, but this is obviously it's a long-term play, but it extends way beyond getting your permits and your shovels in the ground. In essence, for anything that we're talking about right now, I would argue that a developer is asking a host community to mate for life, right? Pretty much. And they want a relationship commensurate with that commitment. Think about it. If you want to be a partner for the rest of your life with somebody, you're not going to get to that point of yes in 2 weeks or 2 months or 6 months. It's going to take a long time to figure out what yes looks and feels like. So next, what's that mean for developers? Early attention and commitment to exploring mutual interest and building trust. Now, that phrase does not roll off the tongue very easily. The developer community does not willingly throw tons of money at that phrase, because their question is, what the hell are mutual interests? How am I going to build trust? And who's going to pay? What's the ROI on that? How do I quantify that in a quarterly report? Well, you don't. But if you don't do it, the chances of success are almost zero. But what else does that need or require? It needs, and I think we're going to hear about it from McKinsey, and Elizabeth talked about it, a new kind of engagement and resourced staff, people who have different skills, people who can honestly listen better than they talk, people who can build relationships, people who can build trust, people who can sit down across from any number of people and have an honest conversation about hopes and dreams and futures. I mean, that's what you have to have, and it sure as hell is not traditional stakeholder engagement. Personally, I hate that phrase. It just sounds so sterile. What we're talking about is building relationships. And relationships are messy and hard, but they're the only thing that allows the dialogue and the sharing of values to flourish in this kind of situation. And so for a business model implication, what does that mean? Well, if you're going to go site something and you're being told that you have to spend a lot more money than you thought up front on a risky sort of proposition of this engagement stuff, factor that into your business planning. The olden days of sort of, a few cups of coffee and you file a permit, those are just done. And the outcomes here are far from certain. And if you really want to understand a community, however that's defined, that takes a long time. Like Elizabeth said, get to know them, get to know their story, get to know their culture. The easy stuff is done, right? It's just done. All that's left now is the heavy sort of spade work to make these things happen. Next. But it's also a two-way street. Hosts are starting to become more of the process now. They're not just innocent bystanders, but they want to say, that's great and that's fabulous. But with that say comes accountability. If they want to be partners in a process, they have to have the chops and the resources to participate on a level playing field with the developer. It's going to require increased capacity. Where does that come from? Who's going to fund that? How does that evolve over time to allow, I think I heard Elizabeth say a lot, equality, mutual approach to these sorts of things. And governance models of communities and how they start to make these decisions, it's going to become more complex. It's going to, as you broaden the tent and expand the number of people who play, you just have to figure out different governance models than might be traditionally available to folks. So, next slide. I mean, that's pretty much it. It's sort of the high level view of what used to be, but what is clearly the current and the future of this kind of profession. And so, thanks for your time. Happy to answer questions at appropriate moment. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. So our third speaker today is Mackenzie Lyon. She is the VP of External Affairs at Perpetua Resources. And Mackenzie has a bachelor's degree in history and 16 years of experience in public affairs, including issue and crisis management, lobbying, strategic communications, social license, and project management. Before joining Perpetua Resources, Mackenzie was a partner at Gallatin Public Affairs, where she helped clients achieve business goals by integrating strategies across communications, government relations, and stakeholder engagement. As VP of External Affairs, Mackenzie leads the direct advocacy and social license development for the Stibnite Gold Project. Mackenzie joined the company in 2017 because she believes that Perpetua is set to lead the way into the next generation of mining that will bring forward the responsible production of the metals and minerals that are essential for a more sustainable future. She also believes that the Perpetua team is dedicated to Idaho and to doing business the right way. Mackenzie is a fifth-generation Idahoan who grew up exploring Idaho's wilderness with her father. With the help of her husband, she is not only instilling her love for Idaho's rich and diverse landscapes in their 3 young children, but they are also teaching them the importance of protecting our environment. All right, Mackenzie, you can take it from here.
Well, thank you, River, for that introduction. And honestly, Jim and Elizabeth too, thank you. It's a real delight to get to hear and learn from other practitioners. This is such a dynamic field, and sounds like I think we've set each other up well in this conversation. So on the next slide, like River said, my career has very much focused on navigating this intersection where business needs and media and communities and public policy interests and goals all meet. And so I spent a decade consulting in Idaho, largely on siting issues, and today I work for Perpetua Resources. We are a mining company that started with this vision that we could go back to an abandoned mine site, remine it for gold and the critical mineral antimony, which is essential for grid storage batteries and defense materials, and while doing so, repair the past environmental damage that had been abandoned. Seems like a win-win, but turns out it's not so simple. However, through very proactive engagement over the last 12 years, we've learned a lot, and I've learned a lot along the way that has really kept the project viable as we've moved through a very public NEPA process. So next slide. And I find the lessons so important right now, especially around social performance and siting issues. There are billions of dollars moving into infrastructure development right now. We have a demand for reshoring supply chains and a demand for independent and new energy sources. So regardless of the industry that you're in, siting issues are going to be a major social, political, and business priority over the next decade. And it can go wrong really quickly. But, like we've heard from Elizabeth and Jim, there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of things that companies can do to set themselves up for success. So I have some observations, and I've put them into a quick list. And it is not a comprehensive list, but I do think it helps capture some of the guiding points that I have found important. So next slide. First, each strategy and each approach really needs to be tailored to the specific needs of each community. I'll also echo here, number 2, start early, like a 2 to 5 year before 2 to 5 years before you have any plans that are developed, that early. So yes, Elizabeth, move as far to the left as you can. 3, hire locally. It adds credibility and it provides insight. 4, start with listening and do not stop listening. And then take that feedback, incorporate it into your plans, and show that you've done that work. 5, show your work, not your words. Trust is built through actions, not in sustainability reports, but those reports are important as well. Next slide. And on 6, I think this is one that I get tripped up on a lot, where I think it's very easy for us to assume that my values and my wants and my needs and my priorities are the same as other people's wants and needs and priorities. And it turns out that that's not true. My hopes and dreams aren't universal, and they are not, my worries aren't other people's top priorities. And so, like has been mentioned, really spending that time and listening and hearing what your community and your stakeholders' needs are, and frame projects from the ground up. And I think that is very true with facts and emotion. I think we often think scientifically that, well, the facts back us up here, but facts don't battle fear. And so in order to build fluency and combat misinformation, we need to engage in practices that first build trust before we're ever really talking about any type of detail. 7, opposition will come. So build internal and external strategies focused on resilience. 8, make sure people know how to engage with you and that they can see your process. And sometimes that is both informal and formal. And if you are making promises and commitments, formalize them and put them into action. 9, third parties matter. So yes, do your stakeholder mapping. Yes, build an advocacy or an advisory council that helps inform your process and inform the shape of what you're building. Build an advocacy coalition to help show that support, but also bring third-party experts in to help guide you. So, and to show you your blind spots. And that could be hiring experts in public affairs, which I will say is not communications and it's not marketing. Conduct public opinion polling, spend the time on the ground, really listening and asking others from the inside out as well. How can we be doing a better job? And then 10, and I think most importantly, is that social performance and this type of work must be a corporate objective and funded and staffed as such. Practitioners must be at a corporate leadership table where decisions are being made. And companies need to be setting both measurable targets and sometimes immeasurable targets and expectations around social performance, but it must be seen as the part of the overall trajectory of a company, that there's sometimes the shortest way to that corporate goal or to that sighting might mean more time. It might mean more personnel. It might mean more investment now, but a company's success will benefit from this type of thinking. Next slide. And so I've put some of these into some examples. So on the next one goes to knowing their why. It's not your why, right? So I think from whether it is securing supply chains and bringing supply chains back home, or in the clean energy space, America right now is struggling with a reckoning of impacts. That there's this realization that whether it is that clean energy is not necessarily impact-free or risk-free energy. And same with supply chains, that if bringing supply chains home, we're also bringing these impacts home. And we are replacing one set of impacts for another. And those impacts, while they may have be lesser in global context, they will now be in someone's backyard. And I think the fear of change or feelings of injustice around these impacts that we quite frankly aren't always used to shouldering, because we've pushed them offshore in so many instances, is oftentimes a more immediate concern than the concern for something like climate change impacts or security of your supply chains. And so we're really quick to assume, oh, if this is a left-leaning community, they understand clean energy and they want clean energy. But does that mean that they are comfortable with the impacts? No. And so we can't assume that. I also think that so much of siting that's going to be taking place will be taking place in rural areas. And so knowing what community wants and needs are, and framing those from the ground up, which means framing issues and framing projects based on those needs and interests. I think there's a really compelling case right now in Idaho around wind siting, where it is now clear that clean energy is a political trigger, and it has resulted in projects becoming politicized and political leaders walking back their support. So when we talk about framing an issue from the ground up, rather than claiming it from, well, of course this is about clean wind, it's about clean energy, it might be that presenting and developing the why behind the project might be more around, well, this is an opportunity for Idahoans to take, greater control on federal lands, or make federal lands pay for us, or opportunities to promote multiple land use and energy independence. And so how we talk about what we're doing needs to be informed by the interests and the wants and the needs of our communities. And in that regard, I would also say that the why is often an emotion, and it can speak more to values than it can speak to things. And so while facts matter, how they are delivered and who delivers them must be deliberate and very informed decisions. So don't fly the folks in from New York, right? I think that's usually a bad first step. On the next slide. So a little bit on resilience. So opposition will come, and building for resilience builds your team and the public and prepares them. The more your communities know about your people and who you are, and the more that they have been brought into the planning, the more resilient the communities will be and you will be to misinformation and opposition. So we started 6 years before we had before our formal permitting process began. We hired local, and when we hired local, for years, the jobs of our team on the ground were just to participate in the community. There was no ask, there's no proselytizing, it was just participating, getting to be known and understanding the community. And we met with everyone on a one-on-one basis and in small groups. We hosted over 1,000 discussions in that 6 years, so that when opposition came, we already had credibility. And when misinformation came, it didn't turn our support, because people had already had a sense of what they trusted and they had already made up their minds. On the next slide, we've heard this a bit too in the conversation today, where starting with a culture of listening first builds a solution finding mindset. So, for example, one of the concerns we heard from our communities in the very beginning was, well, that's great, I know you now, and I'm starting to trust who you are and and your practice of engaging with us. But what about 10 years from now? When this mine is being operated, will it be the same people? Will we know them? Will there be this same openness? And we heard that concern. And so we worked together and we created a community agreement that started the Stibnite Advisory Council. And it guarantees through the life of the mine that each member of our 8 communities will come together with the leadership of the company. And it's an opportunity for sharing information, for hearing, for providing community feedback, for having questions answered, and also, most importantly, just getting to know each other. And so we're building in these solutions and we're formalizing them. We've also taken community feedback very seriously, to the point where we have changed the design of our project twice during NEPA, which, yes, led to delays. But in doing so, we resolved community issues that would otherwise have led to the erosion of our community support or lawsuits. And so it's an example, once again, of where sometimes slow is fast when it comes to working with communities and developing support and listening. And then finally, showing, not telling. Lifting up the curtain a little bit, right? One of our biggest hurdles as an industry in mining is this legacy of mistrust. And so one of the things that I have found is the more I can show who we are, the more I can show our people, the more I can show our folks what modern mining is today, the more I can disarm stereotypes. And I work really hard to show that miners today are your neighbors and that we share many of the same values. And honestly, one of my most important tools has been site visits, just bringing people up, having lunch, sitting with a team, seeing what the practices look like. Getting your boots on the ground in these spaces is an incredible asset to show who you are and what you're doing and what the work looks like. And then finally, on the next slide, I think that this also should be extended to the social and political processes as well. So if we're going to be putting all of this time in an investment into social performance, it's also important to identify opportunities to make that support and that participation and that process visible. Which means identifying opportunities to show, here's how we are engaging with our stakeholders and our regulators and our community members, and to show even our elected officials and investors what we are doing on the ground and what that community support looks like. Because showing social performance, and even if it's not, even if it's 50-50, showing the work that you're putting into it helps every decision maker along the way, whether it's an elected official or a community, will undertake a risk calculation, subconsciously or not. They want to know that you're doing the right thing. They want to know that you are lowering risk, social performance risk around the project, and that you are doing right by their stakeholders. And they want to fall within the majority. And so I think after we build and after we work on social performance, we also have to be conscious and deliberate about how we share the results of that work in a way that's authentic. But we've also got to prove ourselves. And so I think there are a lot of not easy, but there are a lot of ways that we can be doing that a little bit better as well. And that's, for me, that's kind of the overview.
Excellent. Thank you, Mackenzie. So we're going to go into the Q&A session right now, and we've got some good questions in the chat. But I want to start out, with one of my own questions. And this is for everyone. I think more and more people are becoming aware of the messaging that you all shared and kind of the lessons that building anything in North America today is challenging, whether it's a nuclear plant or a mine or a wind farm. And maybe a developer is interested in building out kind of a stakeholder engagement capacity or something in their organization. And as we all know, or the four of us have discussed, there's no textbook on this stuff. It's not like an engineering education, right? You can't pull some textbook off the shelf that gives you a step-by-step guide to this. So I'm curious if you could each kind of share like what has been helpful in standing up these types of teams. I imagine it starts with resources and people, but I'd be curious if you could share some more about, for a company that wants to do this, where do they start?
I'll take that first, if it's all right.
Of course.
Since I went first. So I had a team experience once that has really informed all the work I've done since then, where we had a pretty small team. There were only about 10 of us. And we had people from, who do field work, a lot of the field work out with, like, for me, a lot of my work is not even with the tribal leaders necessarily. I work with a lot of the tribal staff. That's kind of my specialty, and the state staff. But we also had somebody on board who can get into a governor's office. And then we had other people on board who were very good technically, but they also had that intangible people skill, and then we had people who could call, not only could they call the governor's office, but they could get in to see a senator or a congressman. And so for a project to move forward, it needed all those, all those pieces aligned. And I had never had such a small, tightly integrated team that where we would hear something on the street from the local member of the Sierra Club through having coffee with somebody. And then we could know they're getting ready to lobby their senator, and we could go, like, we were so flexible and we were so integrated. We met once or twice a week. And I think one of the problems you see with a lot of these teams that get really large and really stovepiped is you don't have that flexibility. You don't have that finding a problem just before it becomes a bigger problem. And you need to really, you know, the corporate management really needs to be engaged in that. They need to be in those weekly, daily meetings. And they need to have people in a very large array of skill sets. Just having somebody good with people is not enough. You need somebody at the NGO level. You need somebody at the tribal level. You need somebody at the high state government level, all the way up. And so that would be my answer to that.
I just got a simple response. You need a CEO who gets it and has your back. If you don't have that, you'll be fighting internal headwinds the whole time. You'll have to justify your travel expenses and whatever budget you have, and you'll be sort of cast in there. That doesn't work. This is a risky undertaking. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to stub your toe. You're going to say the wrong thing. People are going to say bad things about you and the company. Your CEO needs to get it and back you. If you don't have that, don't even bother.
And I agree with both of those things. I think Elizabeth is exactly right. You need this kind of integrated relationship on the ground that covers politics and communications, and that, you know, the person who knows everyone at Rotary, all of that information is extraordinarily valuable. And yes, if your CEO and your corporate board aren't on board, it's a recipe for disaster. And I think as you're putting this team together, it's also so important to think about the support that the team needs, because sometimes being on the front line, being that person that is always in the front of the room, answering questions for people, absorbing, sometimes emotions and feelings that aren't always fun to have to absorb, is very, very difficult work. And I think that can be undercounted. And we need to make sure that we are resourcing these teams appropriately, to have that to have the bandwidth and the support they need in those circumstances.
Excellent. So I'm going to go to the chat now, or the Q&A, and I think this first one's probably going to be for Elizabeth. The question is, as it relates to tribal outreach, how would you recommend balancing the limited tribal staffing and the desire to include them in project discussions?
Yeah, well, that is the rub, isn't it? And for anybody who's dealt with tribes, as that question implies, a lot of these tribal staff people are wearing 3, 4, 5 hats within their tribe. And it makes it very difficult for them to give the attention to a project that is needed. One thing you can do is, and again, this is a resource question that both Jim and Mackenzie have hit on, is if you can hire somebody, make part of your value to them that you would fund a position locally, whether somebody from their tribe or another tribe's, who you would develop, who you would help train, and they then could be the I don't want to say the go-between, but you know, they could be sort of in the pivotal part of that relationship building. And then if your project goes forward or doesn't go forward, you've left them with capability that they didn't have beforehand. You have somebody now within their system that can take that information and apply it. And so on future projects, and it's really a lot of working with the tribes. Some of them, this probably I should have said in my presentation, for those of you who haven't worked with tribes very much, you have some that are incredibly sophisticated and they're just as sophisticated as any tribal government, or I mean any state government. And you have others that are really struggling to build capacity. And if you can play a positive role in their efforts to kind of stand up a more sophisticated emergency management system, or environmental oversight department, their own EPA, something like that, you can really bring value to the tribe in a way that's meaningful to them long term. So that's what I would suggest, but it is difficult.
Yeah,
Can I
Jim.
just kind of jump on that for a second? I mean, what you're talking about is engagement fatigue, right? I mean, let's be honest. Everybody that we go talk to already has a full-time job. And now we're burdening them with this wonderfully new, exciting opportunity. And we can't sometimes forget. I mean, this is our full-time job. They've already got one. Now we're giving them a second one. And so you got to really be respectful of understanding what their limitations, drivers, capacities are. And Elizabeth's point is spot on. If you can find a way to build their capacity through resources or staffing or whatever, but it's almost common courtesy because you're asking something of an entity. And what do you provide to facilitate that conversation? I mean, it's a threshold issue. You can't assume that they have the time or interest or resources or skills or desire to go talk to you. And so a lot of it is an exercise, I think, in sort of mutual respect and a little bit of humility.
That's great. So we have another question here for everybody. It says, understanding that communities are not monolithic and recognizing that the chances of 100% alignment within a host community is not likely, what constitutes consensus and what level of disagreement is acceptable to move forward in the relationship between communities and developers?
I'll let Mackenzie and Jim jump on that one.
And I think that's hard for, from my perspective, minerals don't move. So our siting is a little bit different in that regard. However, one of the ways I think to think about it are really in a series of concentric circles. Start at the core first. What is the most immediate community, most adjacent to a project? And it's not about numbers, right? It's not about, oh, well, we're at 55% now, so clearly we can move forward. But it's very much a mapping exercise of, who are the community leaders? What are the interests? What are the different stakeholders that will be involved in this process? And, slowly moving through a process from the core outwards to establish, if not, 100% support, then at least awareness and being involved in a process. And if they're willing to be involved in the process and engage with you as you move forward, you might find that it moves from, being opposed to being more neutral, or from being neutral to being more engaged and supportive over time. But it is dynamic, and it's really hard to put a number on it and say, oh, now you're fine, you can move forward. But I'm sure Jim has some advice on that as well.
I think you used the word process a lot, and I think that's it. The best I've ever gotten is somebody saying, look, I don't agree with what you're doing, but I understand what you're doing. Because you made the process visible, I was engaged in it, I got to influence. I didn't get what I wanted, but I understand and can live with it. I mean, that's quite honestly that's what you want to try and get from the people who, hated your guts to begin with, to at least say, okay, I can roll with this because I was involved. And so much of it is how you behave, what your actions are. We've heard that from the other speakers, how you act. Community, the way I kind of model it is that there are a bunch of people who love you. There are a bunch of people who don't like you, but there's a majority of people in the middle, and they tend to go to one of those two extremes based on how you behave, based on your demeanor, based on your level of engagement and respect. And so, there's no magic number. McKinsey's entirely right. You get it when you get it, but you have to, it's all process driven, and you just try and have to be as adaptive and inclusive as you can, and then you see where you end up.
And I think too, and that's where having those third-party advisors can really be helpful, because they can help you assess, okay, you've got, all of these folks engaged in your process and, neutral or, moving towards support, but here are the entities and here's the weight or the potential risk of these other entities. I think of, for example, am I going to upset a recreational group that is then going to bring in national resources because they have those relationships that they can then bring in and make this a real mess? And so it's understanding, it's not only mapping your own relationships, but sometimes it's mapping the weight and the relationships of others as well, and doing that on a very regular basis. You can't just do that in the start and then be like, oh, we're good. We understand the lay of the land, because it is dynamic and it is always changing.
Great. And then another question we have here is, does the federal government have a role to play in facilitating community engagement with developers, especially when projects are identified as being important to national interest?
I'll take that from the tribal perspective. The federal, when it comes to working with tribes, the federal government has that trust responsibility. So they are supposed to be, following that and making sure that the tribe's interests are protected. Do they have a formal role? They certainly had a formal role in breaking trust. And so, it's whether they can come in a productive way. If you're talking about national interest as a way to force a project through, I think you're likely to just leave more damaged relationships in the wake of it than you are to really have a much success. And so, it's hard to answer in the sort of in theory. It would depend so much on the specifics of the project. But I do think there's a role, but I also think you have to be very cautious that they don't come in a fairly clunky way. If I think that a very highly vertically integrated team of a small group that works together very tightly is your best model for implementing something like this, then having the federal government come in, that's kind of the opposite of how they work. And so I think there's some risk to it, but it would depend on what agency you're working with and the leadership, the federal project director that you would be working with.
And I would agree. I think that there is a role for federal regulators to encourage direct engagement. We cannot, we will never and cannot replace that trust responsibility of government to government, or the responsibility of the government to have political participation in their process. But where they can encourage companies and communities to engage early, I think they should. Where they can also help provide the resources to help stakeholders engage in the process, there could be opportunities there. But I would agree that the federal bureaucracy and system is never going to be as nimble and as able to respond to community needs and interests and engage at a level that companies really should be doing themselves.
Cool. So I wanted to go back to a topic that came up a few times here, which is education. And I think that's a complicated or annoying topic, rather, just because it sometimes gets used as it's an entire philosophy, right? It's this feeling that opposition comes from people who are not educated on the topic, right? And this is it's funny having done research into this and looking at the way the nuclear industry has basically promoted itself from the beginning, and education always, and that word specifically, always features in these different kind of master plans for how we're going to do nuclear this decade or next decade. And so it seems a bit misguided or misdirected. However, there does seem to be some improved outcomes when the people you're working with are familiar with the technology, or there does seem to be a specific or kind of individual practitioners tend to be more effective when they can communicate certain technical details and things more clearly. So there is an aspect here of kind of elevating a common understanding of what it is we're talking about. So I'm curious if you want to use the word education or kind of awareness, like how that plays into this work, because I think we're going to keep seeing that term used for a long time, but maybe there's a more generative way to treat it.
If I may, I have very strong feelings about that, as you may have
Please.
detected.
Yeah.
I would love to see the energy field change how it talks in general about its technologies. Every technology has risks, every technology has benefits, and I would love to see a company come into a tribal community and say, you know, this is the life cycle cost, this is the life cycle carbon usage or creation, this is, you know, all these different aspects of a project, and say, here's the benefits and here's the costs, and it's and come at it like, here's our piece, here's what we're proposing to do and where it fits in, but here's all these others, and take it out of the value judgment of good and bad. It gets a little bit to what Mackenzie was saying about, even although you may be going into a politically liberal community, renewable energy isn't always universally loved because of its impacts. But if we can take it out of that you good, me bad language and just say, community, there's these trade-offs, you need energy, we can provide this type of energy. What trade-offs do you want? What trade-offs work best for your community? And bring them in that very early stage communication and help and let them drive it for themselves to some extent. That's a way of informing people and letting them ask as many questions as they need to, delving down as technically as they need to, without coming across as, well, if you just knew what I knew, which is how a lot of it is perceived. So that's my part.
And I think one of my experiences has been, well, one, I position it around transparency. I will make available to anyone the information that we have around our project, what we're doing, and all of the studies and the data and the engineers behind it are available. And so that transparency of information, I think, is really important. And making that conversation in that space available as part of the process. But again, one of the things that I have found is that who is doing the communicating and the engaging can be really important. And sometimes it's not the engineer, but sometimes it is. And knowing that audience and knowing, you know, who it is they want to be speaking to and not making the assumptions. And when I said it needs to be a very deliberate choice of who the people are on the ground engaging, really needs to be informed by who the community is, so that you're not a mismatch on the audience and the representatives of the community, so to speak.
Can I just jump in for a second? I'm not a huge fan of pithy phrases, but there's one I like in this regard, and it's that people don't care what you know until they know you care. All right. So what does that mean? That means that we've heard words like familiar with technology and communicate and common understanding. All that happens after you get to know somebody, after you have a relationship, after you have common language. Then you can figure out what you know and you don't know. Then you can embark on, if you want, an education program, but you don't call it that. But you don't even get to do that until they trust you, right? I mean, this isn't high school where you have to sit in a desk and listen to somebody. This isn't purely voluntary. So what makes them want to listen to you? Well, the fact that you care, the fact that you have a pulse, the fact that you are relatable, the fact that you want to learn from them just as much as you're trying to educate them, right? I mean, we talked about Indigenous knowledge contributing to the betterment of projects. That's happening everywhere, right? Local knowledge matters, local context matters. And it's not just, well, I mean, I'll be quiet, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, you know, when we receive questions, it's important to think about, they might not be looking the answers that people are looking for. It's sometimes like with my 5-year-old, right? When they ask me a tough question, it's not always the answer I give wasn't the question they were asking, right? Where just throwing facts and throwing information or engineering studies at people and saying, well, here's how safe our tailing storage facility is. That's what you wanted to know. No, instead, they wanted to know if their community was going to be safe. And they wanted to know that science and thoughtful thinking and a thoughtful approach had been conducted, right? And so I think it's really easy sometimes to kind of miss each other in our communicating when we're just looking at the surface, and instead really taking a step back and saying, well, okay, what's motivating this question that's being asked, and how can I also get to that component? And I think that goes a bit to the trust that Jim was talking about as well.
Yeah, and it also goes to the needing to have an ongoing conversation. So if you won't know if your response missed the mark unless you're around and available to hear the follow-up questions. And that's the ongoing nature of the relationship that Jim mentioned. You really need to be there and be present and be listening and not talking.
Great. Another thing I wanted to go back to as well was timelines, right? I think one of the things that McKinsey talked a lot about is that this work takes time, and Elizabeth mentioned moving engagement as far left as possible in project planning. But I think that still scares some people, and I think it can be challenging when you're also up against expectations of investors who maybe have money invested, or politicians who are delivering support, and that comes at a cost for them. There's a lot of anxiety about making progress and climate and energy security and all these things. So how do you kind of reconcile those two things?
As a company that's publicly traded and only reliant on investors, it is important to recognize that audience, the investment community, is changing the way they think about the work that we're doing. I believe we are headed towards, and we have already experienced, that our investors and the people interested in, supporting our company are most interested in what are you doing on the ground to ensure social performance and to be doing the right thing to lower risk. And I think from a business perspective, when we can learn how to communicate this type of work and the importance of this type of work to long-term timelines, to long-term costs, and to long-term risk reduction, then we can help advance the importance and the significance that this type of work is given. But I think it's very well understood, at least from the people that we're engaging with, where there are very few left who think that you can just skate by and no one's going to notice you as you cite a project. And then if you get to that point where you haven't done thorough engagement, and all of a sudden you're engaged in a public process and you are surprised by opposition or a turn in public sentiment, that's the biggest risk that I think this type of work can help avoid.
Yeah, Jim or Elizabeth, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, part of it is it's good to have the CEOs back, because these things never get done on time, right? They're never, that's just rule number one. But I think you also, it's okay to be honest with people that, this isn't an infinite process, right? But at the same time, if the community even gets a whiff that you're just you're just playing a game and you really want to file a permit on a certain date, you're done, right? And so I think creating a process where everybody knows what's on the table, where expectations are freely exchanged, and trying to find some common ground is an okay thing. But everybody knows money doesn't grow on trees. You can't be doing stuff forever. But again, if you find an opportunity to create a project, for lack of a better word, where there's mutual support on multiple sides, then you can kind of carry it through and try and figure out how to meet your milestones and your targets. But it can't be unilaterally imposed, right? It never, ever, ever works that way. And communities are very adept at I hate that term. People who don't want to see it go forward are very adept at tying it up forever. right? They can do that. And so the more that you can create a coalition of the willing to sort of buffer that process, the better off you are. But schedule is a big deal. It's a real issue.
Yeah, and I would just add, I agree. I think all three of us are pretty strong agreement with the general outlines of this work. You're not going to, you're unlikely to have success if you don't incorporate it on the pretty far left of your project schedule. So that it's just a requirement at this point, based on the world as it is. I think if you're making an honest assessment of your project risks, this is something that you can help reduce your risk. On the other hand, I will say I have had experiences where the CEO or the board of directors is not behind you and is not willing to engage in what they see as a highly risky process, even when it's been demonstrated to work in their industry and other situations. And as a practitioner, I look very carefully at that when I'm considering taking on work.
I would also just say, like, investing now and investing early saves in the long run versus the costs you will incur of, not only just potential legal costs and, bringing in, the expensive public affairs firms that you need to help if you find yourself in a crisis. That is much more expensive than just doing the right thing and investing in it from the very beginning. But you're also putting at risk the entire project and all of that investment. And when you compare that to, hiring some people on the ground and starting out right, it's a very, very small cost in comparison.
Yeah, if I may, I've seen the business shift over time where most of the calls originally were, my project's in a ditch, come help me get it out.
Right.
Right. And now you're starting to see people saying, how can I keep it out of the ditch to begin with? Yeah. There's a little bit of a shift there, but the traditional mindset is that, I'm going to spend 50 cents up front to try and, appease the stakeholder thing. But if I have to write zillion-dollar checks for attorneys once this thing blows up, everybody assumes that's kind of okay. I mean, that's been the way it's been going on for such a long period of time. But the math on that's completely wrong.
Yeah.
In that it's still hard from a cultural mindset to get for some entities to want to invest up front in this risk reduction program. But you can run the numbers and do the math, and it actually pencils out. CFOs are starting to realize that, obviously. Senior risk managers are starting to get that. But it's still very easy to write attorney checks when it all fails, as opposed to the kind of stuff that we're doing up front. That's just that's an old school mindset still around.
That's really helpful. I think we have time for one more question I wanted to bring up, which is and close it out with, which is just about trust. Because that concept, it seems to be kind of the currency for this type of work. And my impression is that just the point of history that we're in right now, things are complicated because things are very divisive. Trust is limited, and often when you're trying to introduce a project to a group of people, there are much deeper issues that need to be interacted with than whether or not they actually approve of this very surface level project. And so when it comes back to trust, what I'm specifically curious about is how it gets distributed and who is responsible for what. And this kind of goes back to a question we just had in the chat, for example, which is does the federal government have a role to play here? And I'm curious, does academia have a role to play? What type of trust should a company itself have? What do third party organizations look like, and how is that distributed? Because should a company be doing this 100% by itself, or does it need to be shared among more people and more organizations?
Can I try? When I was doing work with DOE in 2015 with Elizabeth and others, one senior DOE official said, if we do this right, we're going to reinvent society. And that was actually pretty profound, because what we were trying to do is obviously, generate public support for siting a long-term nuclear waste storage facility. And that required dialogue and relationships and new ways of thinking and new ways of governance and decision making and all that sort of stuff that will ultimately, be pretty impressive once it all happens. But I don't think it's any one entity's job. I mean, the really fun part about this is that everybody gets to play. It makes it difficult, but nobody's excluded from this process. I don't care what you're citing. Nobody. There's no way you can say no, you can't come in, right? You've got to be open and porous, and you've got to be nimble and flexible and adaptive and creative. And I just think that I'm not being naive, but that comment really resonated with me, because that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to give everybody, for lack of a better word, a say in their collective future.
I think this kind of work is too hard to do if you didn't sincerely believe in the impact and the importance of changing how business is being done and changing the trajectory that we are on. We have to believe that sincerely in order to do this work. And it's the only reason that I'm a kid from Idaho who grew up working for a mining company, because I truly believe that it can and should be done better. And I want to see that path, and it will take everyone. And one of the greatest compliments that I think we've received over the last many years as a company was from a conservation group here in Idaho who said they are our favorite people with maybe our least favorite project. And just that, right? That we're building that trust, and that you know me, you know my intentions, you know what drives me in this process. And I'm going to ensure that the work that we do shows that from the top of the company all the way through. If you don't sincerely want and see the importance of this work, step back and don't try to do it, and good luck to you. But you really have to see a bigger vision in order to be successful in doing it.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and staying sort of at that practitioner in the field level. You really have to have, I'm going to use one of Jim's words, that sort of nimbleness and emotional intelligence, so that if somebody comes at you and they're angry, and they're really angry, but it's something that you actually don't have anything to do with, but they're taking it out on you, which is a very common human response to a situation, particularly when you're feeling some stress. Don't take it personally. Please don't take it personally. There are things behind that. You can't build trust if you just react to every emotion thrown at you, because this stuff tends to be emotional. It hits at people's values. And if you want to build trust, they have to feel like they can bring these difficult moments to you, and you'll handle it appropriately. And I am cautious about how broadly, do you want to bring in academia? Do you want to bring in the federal government? There's certainly risks there. I would be very careful in your strategy. But one thing to think about is give the community or the tribe funding to hire people who are independent experts, who aren't going to champion the project necessarily. Let them build their own trust through their own research. And that can also be a technique that can be very effective. So that would be my addition to that question.
I love it. Thank you. So we're just about at time right now, and I just wanted to close it out and thank everyone who attended. Thank our communication staff at INL who helped facilitate all this. And then, of course, thank our presenters. I've been lucky enough to have multiple conversations like this one with you all, and I enjoy every one of them. I'm just very excited that this one was recorded so I can share this with more people. But yeah, so thank you again. Thank you to everyone. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
everyone. Thanks, everyone.